All right, good afternoon or good evening. This is Lucky Lynx, and my partner and I were talking about a subject today that I think he actually is the one that suggested I do the video on this. He said, he says, that's the thing you should do a video on. People will. I've been talking about this for a very long time, and this is something I usually talk about only with clients or in certain situations where a person needs to be made very uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people will be uncomfortable by what I'm about to say and how I phrase this. But we're going into at least the Western New Year now. Tibetan New Year happens in February. The Western New Year happens, obviously, in a couple of days, and this is something that I think makes people think. And I several times in my life I've actually pointed this out to people, and they've gotten very uncomfortable with the idea. Very uncomfortable. But this is one for you to think, and I'm gonna see if I have any advice as I do this from my friend here as well. I want you guys to think about as you go into the new year here, if everything were to change, as everyone says every year, they always hope that there are changes coming. And I'm going to assert that this year I really do believe and I feel and I see a year of many changes coming ahead. But if it really did change the way that people really say that they wanted it to change, what would they do? Now, how do I say this? If you knew that the diseases that were out there could be healed, and that there was a simple way for them to be healed, and that all your ailments suddenly would no longer be a problem. Also, if you suddenly found yourself filled up with prosperity, and you didn't have to worry about the bills anymore. If you found yourself in a position where money was no longer being used, and that wasn't the measure of a person's worth, what would you do? How would you interact with other people? What would you draw your self-worth from? If your ailments were cured, if your salary were no longer the case, if money was no longer the thing that was being used in an exchange, but real value for value, what would be the value that you would use as a commodity in the world to make your way? If everything that lined up next year and everything collapsed and all that was left was the need to create a value for value exchange, what would you exchange? What do you have that has value? Maybe that's something that will give you something to think about as you move into the new year. I'm not going to put any other caveat on it, because a lot of times people will be like, well, the thing that you'd be doing if you didn't have to worry about money, that's the thing you should. That's not what I'm asking you. How would you draw your value of yourself if you couldn't compare what your salary was to someone else? And before you think that you don't compare yourself to anyone else, realize that people are always walking around saying, well, I'm blessed, at least I've got a house over my head. Well, that means that you're comparing yourself to the guy who's living on the street corner who doesn't have a house over, roof over his head, the one who can't fill his belly. So if it wasn't a case anymore of, well, I have worth because I can fill my belly and I got a roof over my head. If it wasn't a case anymore of, well, I got this car and I got this job. And if it wasn't a case of, well, I can afford this, therefore I am this, what would you draw your value from? And what would you spend your time doing? If you didn't have to fret anymore about the ailments that you had, if you didn't have to struggle anymore against the need to make a living or to pay the electric bill, If those things on Maslow's pyramid, and those of you who don't know what Maslow's, look up Maslow's hierarchy of needs for those of you who don't know. If the lower ones were taken care of, what would you draw your value from, and how would you spend your time? And the first thing that people always say is, well, I travel. And then I'm going to add to those who say, well, I would travel. What are you going to give back to this space that has value? What are you going to give that has a value for value exchange? If you decide that you're going to go from this place to this place and this place, what would you give that has value as you go? What would you do with your life? How would you build passion? What would you do with yourself? If you didn't have to fret, if you didn't have to worry, if you didn't have to struggle. And the reason I bring this up, I once asked this to an ex of mine once, and he looked at me like deer in a headlight. And I said, what are you going to do if it all collapses and there's no money anymore and you don't need money? And he looked at me like a deer in a headlight and he said, I don't know. And I knew at that moment that that was a really important question to be asking. Because people are always asking, how do I get back to myself? Who am I? Who am I truly? How do I create how do I really engage in some kind of spiritual journey? What would you do with your time if you were just here and those things that you define yourself by? Because I think the majority of the people I meet day in, day out define themselves by their struggle. I had it so bad because I have to suffer through this job. If you couldn't define yourself by suffering anymore, how would you define yourself? And I know a lot of people will knee-jerk it and go, well, I'd love everyone and everything. I doubt that. And this is why I say that. I'm not saying that some people wouldn't, but I will say that a lot of people who say that if they had time on their hand, they'd create peace, they'd be loving, they'd do everything. I watch people when they got time off, and I watch what they do with it. When people got time off, they find something to fret and worry about. They find something to struggle with. If you didn't have to struggle with your health woes anymore, if you didn't have to struggle with paying the electric bill, if you didn't have to work that job anymore that treated you horribly, what would you give to the world that has value? I'm Lucky Lynx, as always, wishing you success and good fortune in all that you do. Hey, if you would like to get a reading from me, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. And if you would like to learn how to read the tarot in the new year, I got two tarot classes. I got one that's a basic and one that's an advanced. And I got one that's two Lenormand classes, one that's a basic and one that's a Grand Tableau class. I got one on how to read playing cards, I got one on how to read Mexican lottery, and I got one on how to read crystal ball. If you'd like to take any of those classes, contact me, 779-302-8009. I can slip you into any of those classes right now. The way I structured them, I can slip you right in. Hey, if you want to get your Tibetan astrology done, or your cosmology, which is mind-blowing, and those of you who've been watching my station know that I've been studying cosmology, and the things that I've discovered about myself in cosmology are astonishing. And there is no mistake why you are here. But I will say at this point in my life, after doing and working with people for the majority of my adult life, people do not know why they're here, and they're really underestimating themselves, and they are not being even a fraction of what they can be. Not even a fraction. And I think that people shrug their shoulders and say, well, what are you going to do? This is the way life is. There's this wonderful line in Contact where the Jodie Foster's character says, that's funny. I always thought life was what we make it. Hey, for those of you who would like to get your cosmology or your astrology done, in that case, contact me, same way, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. Be aware, this is Tibetan astrology, Tibetan cosmology. And for those of you who would like a kill core done, kill core is where I make a map of your life, and then I employ bond processes. And the bond processes remove obstacles, set things into motion. We can do that too. I can tell you how to do that. If you contact me, same way, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. And hey, for those of you who've donated, thank you so much for donating. I really appreciate you. If you like these videos, they make you think, and you want to donate to help keep them coming, well then, I'm going to put my PayPal, my Venmo below. You guys have a happy new year, and I hope this question makes you think, or these questions make you think real deep. I hope they make you uncomfortable, because sometimes when these things that we ask make us uncomfortable, it leads us to what's really important.